1942. The Eastern Front. In the pitch-black darkness of the Russian night, German soldiers huddle around their campfires, desperate for a moment of peace. But the peace is a lie. High above, a sound emerges, not the roar of a jet, but a ghostly hiss. It sounds like a broomstick sweeping through the air. Within seconds, the camp erupts into a hellscape of fire and twisted metal. No warning, no radar contact, just silent death. The terrified survivors look to the sky and scream one word: Nachthexen, the night witches. These weren't mythical monsters. They were young women, some barely out of school, flying wooden planes that should have been in a museum. They had no parachutes, no radios, and no fear. Tonight, we uncover the 6,000-word lost chronicle of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. This is the story of how a suicide unit of women became Hitler's most hated nightmare. The Soviet Union in 1941 was not just a country at war, it was a nation staring into the abyss. Operation Barbarossa had unleashed a blitzkrieg so ferocious that the Red Army was reeling, losing millions of men and thousands of aircraft in just the first few months. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. Smoke from burning villages choked the horizon from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In this atmosphere of total desperation, the Soviet leadership was forced to consider the unthinkable. While the Western Allies were still debating if women should even drive ambulances, Soviet women were already picking up rifles. But there was one barrier left: the cockpit. The woman who shattered that glass ceiling was Marina Roskova. She was the Soviet Union's answer to Amelia Earhart, a navigator of legendary skill and a woman with direct access to Joseph Stalin. Roskova began receiving thousands of letters from young women across the USSR. These weren't fan mail, they were pleas for help. "Teach us to fly," they wrote. "Our brothers are dead, our homes are gone, let us fight." Roskova took these letters to the Kremlin. She didn't just ask for a few female pilots, she demanded 3 entire aviation regiments composed entirely of women, from the pilots and navigators to the mechanics and ground crews. Stalin, usually a man of rigid tradition, looked at the maps of the retreating front lines and signed the order on October 8, 1941. The mobilization was unlike anything history had ever seen. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed. These were girls who had grown up in the shadow of the revolution. Students from the Moscow State University, farm girls from the Siberian steppes, and factory workers from the Ural Mountains. They were young, idealistic, and fueled by a cold, sharp rage. One volunteer, Nadezhda Popova, remembered the day she joined. "We were young, we were pretty, and we were about to become killers." They left behind their silk dresses, their textbooks, and their families. Many of them cut their long hair short to fit into flight helmets, a symbolic sacrifice of their old lives. They were sent to the town of Engels, a small, desolate training hub. Here, the reality of their situation set in. They were not greeted as heroes. The male commander saw them as a burden, or at best, a propaganda stunt. They were given men's uniforms, oversized tunics that reached their knees, and boots so large they had to stuff them with newspaper and torn rags just to keep them on during marches. But Roskova didn't let them complain. She drilled them harder than any male unit. She knew if they failed, no woman would ever be allowed in the sky again. They studied navigation, aerodynamics, and military law for 18 hours a day. They practiced in the freezing mud and the howling wind. This was the birth of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were about to be handed the keys to the most dangerous machines in the Soviet arsenal, not because they were the best, but because they were the only ones left. In 1941, the PO-2 was a relic. Designed in 1928, it was a trainer and a crop duster. Its frame was made of light plywood. Its wings were covered in nothing but doped canvas. It was a plane you could literally put your finger through. There was no armored plating to protect the pilot. There was no fuel tank seal to prevent explosions. It was a flying tinderbox. The cockpit was open to the sky. This meant that in the Russian winter, the pilots were flying in temperatures that could freeze skin in minutes. They had no radios to talk to each other or the ground. They had no radar. Their only navigation tools were a compass, a stopwatch, and their own eyes. But the most chilling detail was the weight limit. Because the PO-2 had such a tiny engine, only 125 horsepower, it could not carry much. Each plane could carry exactly 2 bombs, one under each wing. To save every possible gram of weight so they could carry those bombs, the High Command made a decision that would define the Night Witches: no parachutes. The logic was brutal. If you were hit, you were going to die anyway. Parachutes were expensive, heavy, and unnecessary for a unit flying so low to the ground. For these women, every takeoff was a suicide mission. They knew that if their engine failed or if a German searchlight caught them, there was no jumping out. They would burn with their aircraft. However, as the women began to fly the PO-2, they realized that this flying coffin had a secret strength. Its maximum speed was only 93 miles per hour. Ironically, this was slower than the stall speed of the German Messerschmitts. When a German ace tried to line up a Night Witch in his sights, he would fly right past her, or his own plane would fall out of the sky because he couldn't fly slow enough to aim. The PO-2 was so light it could turn on a dime, disappearing into a forest or behind a hill before the Germans could react. The Night Witches also developed their signature move, the silent glide. Because the PO-2 was essentially a giant kite with an engine, it could glide for long distances. As they approached the German lines, the pilots would throttle their engines back to idle. The plane would become a ghost. All the Germans would hear was the hiss of the wind through the wing wires, a sound they likened to a witch's broomstick. Each plane only carried 2 bombs, which meant the 588th had to be relentless. They didn't just fly one mission. They would fly to the target, drop their bombs, fly back, land, reload, and take off again. On a single night, a pilot might fly 18 separate missions. They were ground crews as well, often lifting the heavy bombs onto the racks with their own hands because there weren't enough men to help. The Germans were humiliated. The superior Luftwaffe was being bombed by wooden toys piloted by sewing machine girls. The Nazis began to spread rumors that the Soviet government was giving these women pills to give them night vision. They couldn't accept that these girls were simply better, braver, and more disciplined than the men they were killing. The PO-2 wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a psychological weapon designed to strip the German army of their sleep and their sanity. The training at Engels was designed to turn schoolgirls into soldiers in just a few months, a process that normally took years. Marina Raskova was a relentless taskmaster. She knew that the eyes of the entire Red Army were on them, waiting for them to fail. The girls lived in cramped, unheated barracks. They were woken up at 4 a.m. by the piercing blast of a whistle. They would run through the snow in those oversized men's boots, their feet blistered and bleeding. There was no time for vanity. They practiced Morse code until their fingers cramped. They studied maps of the front lines until they could draw the terrain of the Donbass from memory. The weather was their first enemy. The Russian steppe in winter is a place of brutal, bone-chilling cold. The girls had to learn how to keep their engines from freezing. They would spend hours in the middle of the night, hand-cranking the propellers, the freezing metal sticking to their palms. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the social isolation. The male regiments stationed nearby treated the 588th with open contempt. They called them the dolls, or the little sisters. When the women walked into the mess hall, the men would whistle or make jokes about them belonging in a kitchen. The instructors were even tougher. They would take the girls up in the middle of thunderstorms or pitch-black nights, cut the engine, and tell them to find their way home. One pilot, Galina Balsova, recalled an instructor who would scream at them, "The Germans won't care if you're a woman. They will burn you all the same." Instead of breaking, the women bonded. They formed a sisterhood that was unbreakable. In the few minutes of free time they had, they would recite poetry to each other or sing folk songs. They decorated their barracks with wild flowers. This was their rebellion, maintaining their humanity in a system designed to turn them into machines. The final test was the night navigation exam. They had to fly a PO-2 in total darkness, with no ground lights and find a tiny target in the middle of a forest. If they missed by even a few meters, they failed. Many didn't make it. But those who did were no longer the girls who had left Moscow. They were hardened, focused, and deadly. By the time the 588th was ready for the front, they were the most disciplined unit in the Soviet Air Force. They had mastered a plane that was a death trap. They had survived a training regime that was a nightmare. They had ignored the laughter of the men. They were ready to become the Night Witches. On the day they left for the front, Marina Raskova stood before them. She didn't give a speech about glory. She looked at her little sisters and said, "You are going to a place where there is no mercy. Be the mercy for your people and the fire for your enemies." The 588th Night Bomber Regiment did not just fight a war of bombs. They fought a war of nerves. Their tactics were born out of a desperate need to survive in an aircraft that was essentially a slow-moving target. While a German Messerschmitt could hit speeds of over 350 miles per hour, the Polikarpov PO-2 struggled to reach 90. To survive, the Night Witches had to become invisible. The core of the strategy was the engine cut glide. This maneuver required nerves of steel and perfect timing. As the pilots approached their target, usually a fuel depot, a bridge, or a German barracks, they would fly to a high altitude. Once within striking distance, the pilot would throttle the engine back until it stopped entirely. Suddenly, the rattling sewing machine sound was gone. The plane became a silent glider, a wooden bird of prey slipping through the dark. The only sound was the eerie, high-pitched whistling of the wind passing through the wire struts of the wings. For the German soldiers below, this sound became the stuff of nightmares. It was a signal that death was already overhead. Because the planes were made of wood and fabric, they didn't show up on Nazi radar. The first the Germans knew of an attack was when the bombs began to detonate in the middle of their camp. But the tactics didn't end with silence. They used coordinated harassment. The Night Witches didn't attack in large formations like the Americans or the British. They attacked in waves of 3 planes. The decoys. 2 planes would fly in first, acting as bait. They would deliberately fly within range of the German searchlights. The distraction. As the searchlights locked onto them and the anti-aircraft guns, or the flak, began to fire, the 2 planes would bank wildly, crisscrossing each other to confuse the gunners. The striker. While the Germans were focused on the 2 decoys, the 3rd plane, the silent glider, would slip in from the shadows, drop its bombs, and vanish back into the night. Once the 3rd plane had dropped its load, it would bank away, and the other 2 would take turns slipping out of the lights to drop their own bombs. Then they would fly back to base, reload, and return to do it all over again. This was psychological warfare at its finest. German troops were being deprived of sleep night after night. They were terrified to light a cigarette or a campfire for fear of attracting a witch. The constant stress led to a breakdown in German morale in the Eastern Front. The Nazis were so frustrated that they began to claim the Soviet women were being given secret injections to give them the night vision of a cat. They couldn't accept that they were simply being outplayed by superior pilots. The risk of these tactics was astronomical. Flying so low meant they were within range of simple machine guns and even rifles. Flying without an engine meant that the pilot miscalculated the distance, the plane would stall and crash before reaching the target. And because the PO-2 was so slow, a single lucky shot from a flak gun could turn the canvas plane into a flying torch. The Night Witches didn't just fly, they danced with death every single night, using the very silence of the sky as their most lethal weapon. In the world of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the border between life and death was as thin as the canvas on their wings. To the German soldiers, they were supernatural terrors, but in reality, they were young women living a life of extreme physical and emotional exhaustion. Between the years 1942 and 1945, these pilots lived a life that would have shattered the strongest of men. Life at the front was a constant battle against the elements. Because their cockpits were open, the pilots were exposed to the brutal Russian general winter. The wind chill at flying altitude often dropped to -40°C. They didn't have the luxury of heated suits or even windshields that worked. If a pilot touched the metal frame of the cockpit with a bare hand, her skin would instantly freeze to it, tearing away when she pulled back. Many pilots returned from missions with permanent frostbite on their cheeks and noses, their faces scarred by the very air they flew through. The schedule was grueling. A typical night involved 10 to 15 sorties. They would take off, drop 2 bombs, fly back, land on a dark, bumpy field, wait for the ground crew to hand crank the engine and strap on 2 more bombs, and take off again. They did this until the first light of dawn. By the time they climbed out of their cockpits, they were so exhausted they often collapsed on the ground, falling asleep in their oil-stained flight suits before they could even reach their barracks. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight. Because they were an all-female unit, the bond between them was sisterly and intense. They shared everything: meals, letters from home, and the few moments of peace they could find. When a plane didn't return, the silence in the barracks was deafening. Because they flew flying torches without parachutes, a missing plane almost always meant a horrific death. They had to watch their best friends turn into balls of fire in the night sky, unable to do anything but continue their mission. Despite the darkness of their reality, they clung to their humanity. They famously painted flowers on the sides of their planes and used navigation pencils as lipstick before a mission. It was a small act of defiance, a way to remind themselves that they were still women, still human in a world that treated them as expendable machines of war. They also faced constant pressure to prove themselves. Even after hundreds of successful missions, some male commanders still viewed them as a PR stunt. This skepticism meant the Night Witches pushed themselves harder than any other regiment. They refused to take breaks, even when sick or injured. To them, every bomb dropped was a statement. We are here, we are capable, and we will not be ignored. This life on the edge defined the 588th. They lived in a state of permanent fight or flight, fueled by thin soup, black bread, and an unbreakable devotion to their comrades. They knew that for a Night Witch, there was no retirement, only the next mission or the final crash. By 1944, the tide of the war had turned. The Soviet steamroller was pushing the Wehrmacht back toward the borders of the Third Reich, and the Night Witches were at the tip of the spear. They had moved from the defensive trenches of the Caucasus to the liberation of Poland, and finally to the heart of the beast, Germany itself. The Nazis were now in a state of total collapse, but they fought like cornered animals. For the 588th, the final months were the deadliest. As they closed in on Berlin, the German anti-aircraft fire became denser, and the Luftwaffe deployed specialized night fighters equipped with radar to hunt the wooden ghosts. Yet, the witches never faltered. They flew through walls of fire to ensure that the German army had no place to hide, even in their own backyard. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment had achieved a record that was nothing short of miraculous. They had flown over 30,000 missions and dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi targets. They had seen 30 of their sisters fall in battle, women who died without parachutes, engulfed in flames, but never wavering from their course. The ultimate recognition of their final victory came when 23 of these pilots were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest distinction the nation could bestow. It was a bittersweet triumph. Marina Raskova, the woman who had started it all, didn't live to see the end. She had died in a crash early in the war, but her spirit was in every cockpit that reached Berlin. On VE Day, as the world celebrated, the Night Witches stood among the ruins of the Reich. They had proven that a plywood plane and a determined heart could bring an empire to its knees. They had entered the war as girls playing soldier and emerged as the most decorated female unit in the history of aviation. Their final victory wasn't just over the Nazis, it was over every person who said they couldn't do it. The engines of the Polikarpov Po-2 have long since gone cold, and the wooden frames have mostly rotted away into the soil of the Eastern Front. But the legend of the Night Witches remains etched into the history of warfare as a testament to the power of the human spirit. What makes their stories so haunting is not just the bombs they dropped, but the silence they left behind. After the war ended, the Soviet Union, the very nation they had saved, initially tried to downplay their role. The 588th Regiment was disbanded. Most of the pilots returned to civilian life, becoming teachers, engineers, or mothers. They packed away their flight suits, their oil-stained medals, and their memories of the whistling wind. But you cannot bury a legend. Decades later, when the archives were opened and the survivors began to speak, the world finally understood the scale of their sacrifice. These women had faced two enemies, the Nazi invaders and the crushing weight of prejudice. They beat both. They flew planes that were essentially toys against the most technologically advanced military of the 20th century. And they didn't just survive, they dominated. They showed us that bravery isn't about having the best equipment or the loudest engine. Bravery is flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire in a wooden plane because you believe in the person sitting in the cockpit next to you. It's about cutting your engine in the dead of night and trusting the wind to carry you home. As we look back at the records of World War II, the Night Witches stand out as a reminder that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is a person with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They were the daughters, the sisters, and the heroes of a generation that refused to break. Today, the names of pilots like Nadezhda Popova and Marina Raskova are spoken with the same reverence as the greatest aces of the war. They proved that in the dark of night, fear has no gender and courage has no limit. Next time you hear the wind whistling through the trees on a cold, dark night, remember the 588th. Remember the young girls in oversized boots who flew without parachutes. Remember the Nacht Hexen, the women who turned the sky into a nightmare for the monsters of their time.